Hey there, thank you so much for joining me again. On this video today, I am going to be tackling one of the black arts of Dorico, and that is the percussion map, but not in the way that I have in the past. This was actually inspired by a Discovering Dorico live stream that the Dorico folks did a couple of weeks ago, and actually prompted me to get more into my percussion library, and particularly writing snare parts that were much more convincing. I'm not a snare player, so I'm not a percussionist really. I had to learn quite a bit about how a percussionist is thinking and how their parts are written. So that was sort of one thing. I'm not going to cover that so much. It's not a tutorial on writing snare parts. I'm just explaining how I got into this particular topic. And there was still confusion for me around custom note heads and percussion maps and which ones were doing which and when I need to use which and do I need to use them at all. I also ran into a few significant time wasters that I think I solved, so I also want to share a handful of tips. So what I'm going to do in today's video is basically explain how what I'm trying to do with an example, trying to make it sound like realistic snare, the kind of complex library I'm using that has lots of different samples, and then how I map those using a combination of percussion maps and custom note heads, and how all of that's configured. So it's going to be a walkthrough as well as sort of a general philosophy of how one can approach doing this kind of work in Dorico. So to get started, let me take myself off the screen, and I'm going to just play this very simple snare line here. So you can hear, this is what I'm trying to avoid, let's say. Sorry, I have to bring up my... There we go. Okay, so that is my existing snare part. That's just kind of a dumb snare that's loaded up, and there's no life to it at all. Let's listen to it again, just hear how static that sounds. Okay, that's just not what I want as, as a composer. I want my eventual playback to be super realistic. Now, actually, that brings me to an important caveat for different folks in this audience. I'm not here trying to necessarily recreate a score that is the most readable. I know that there is notation for flams and drags and things like that. There's, as far as I know, no way to say, okay, this grace note, when it's before a hit on snare, make that a flam. What you can do is have the grace note, actually trigger a sample, and then, triggers it very quickly like a flam. But in my case here, I'm really concerned with the playback. I'm really trying to get the playback to be ideal. And there, in order to achieve that, I'm using sampled flams, sampled drags. So these are played the whole, I'm not trying to recreate the individual MIDI hits. I want to trigger one sample that triggers a flam because it sounds more natural. I'm going to play you the other example here, and you can hear what that sounds like. So this is... All right, so radical difference between this, which is super static, and this, which is way more human. Okay, so the main goal here is playback, not notation. But if you wanted to go in and notate this, nothing about my approach would prevent you from doing that. It's just that I'm not giving my parts typically to a player, so it's just spending time on it that I don't need to spend. Okay, so how do we get the playback? There's a combination of using note heads and percussion maps, and I'm going to just explain that in detail here. So I'm going to take myself off the camera, and let's dive into this. Yeah. These examples are definitely inspired by a variety of sources, and the whole topic inspired by the Discover Dorico live stream that happened recently. So Over here on my left, I just want to point out over here, I have a spreadsheet, basically because I definitely advise that you get your ducks in a row before you do this. This is like, if you've tried to do this, you know my pain, and I know your pain. I love Dorico. I love it with all my heart. It saves me so many thousands of hours, and I love the development team. They're just great. They provide so much support. All of that. Very, very grateful. Percussion maps have had me pulling my hair out on a number of occasions. It can be really challenging and really stressful. Anyway, all of that is to say, I actually made this spreadsheet so that I could get my head around this topic. So I suggest grab a couple of Tylenol and start up a spreadsheet. And it just pays dividends, because when you are actually flip-flopping between the different dialogues that you have to use in order to configure all this, it can be really disconcerting if you're trying to hold all this data in your head. For me, anyway, that was my experience. There are a number of caveats. So let me take myself off screen and talk a little bit about what we're looking at here. So in this top table up here, highlighted in green, these are samples from my library that I'm intending to use in this run over here. The ones that are not highlighted, these are other keys and samples that actually are in my library. I'm using the Majestic Pro Snare from Orchestral Tools Percussion Berlin series. Okay, so I'm not using all the samples. So I've got them listed down here, and this table is basically exactly what you would see if you started up the dialogue to create a percussion map, and you'll see that in just a second. Okay, so I've got my notes over here, and we're going to go starting in setup. I'm going to find my snare, which is right here. Now, I had to create a custom instrument. I have made videos about creating custom instruments, so you can check on my channel for that if you search my channel. But this Majestic snare is obviously not built in. I'm going to go to Edit Percussion Playing Techniques, and this is where you can create note heads. Now, I'm going to explain how I have come around to understanding note heads, because I think that this is was difficult for me to understand. I'm going to try and do it here in less than a minute. When you create playing techniques in Dorico, like spiccato, let's say, or even the built-in ones like staccato, they are things you put in your score that ultimately are meant to convey to the playback engine which samples to trigger. The same thing is happening here with percussion instruments, and you can see right behind me here, this is titled Percussion Instrument Playing Techniques. So think of them as the same thing. The playing techniques that you set up for different playing techniques for violins or for brass, you're doing that for percussion. You are essentially saying, okay, elements of my score, things in my score that you see are supposed to convey to the playback engine what to play back. Now there's a couple of stages here. First, you have to define those. What are those playing techniques? And secondly, you have to connect them using playback techniques to an actual sample. So the step we're in right here is defining them, and we're defining them in the context of the drums. You could define these exclusively in a percussion map, but I'm going to show you, as you're going to see in a minute here, why having them as note heads, in my view, makes it a much more visual, much richer and more intuitive experience for writing out your drum parts. But basically, you know, I've got all these highlighted in green over here. Let me take myself off the screen again. All of these are the samples I'm triggering, and so I have actually a note head for each one of them right here. Things like flam and drag and so on and so forth. Okay? They all are just set to natural note heads. I'm not actually using custom note heads. That is not, again, I'm not concerned about making this readable to a player. I'm just trying to get playback to be correct. None of them have overrides. They're all just straight up and down what they are. Now, because I've created them as note heads here, I get a very powerful little tool in my key editor over here in the right zone, or the right mode, which you'll see right here. So I actually have all of the note heads listed, and it's almost like a mini key editor where I can say, you know, I actually want that note here. Sorry, I actually want that note, let's say, to be a drag instead of a flam, and I can hold down Option and Shift or Alt Shift, and I can move it down to drag, and now it's going to trigger that sample. So this just is like a key editor, makes it very easy for me to manipulate things, but in a visual way, and I can see, I can see what my options are visually here. I don't have to remember, because this is one of the challenges with working with percussion libraries, especially complex ones, is which keys on the keyboard go to what. This makes it all very visual for me. Okay, so that's the first step. But if I don't have sorry, whoops, I'm going to go to here. If I don't have a percussion map set up, or it's not configured correctly, even though I have my note head set up, you're not going to hear anything on playback. Of course, because although I've set up the definition here of what's possible with this instrument, Dorico has no idea how to access these samples yet. So the second step is to come in here and set up a percussion map. Now I've set one up here so you can see what my example looks like. I've just called it PM for Percussion Map Majestic Pro Snare. I highly recommend do not use an expression map and a percussion map. Just zero out your expression map, or maybe use dynamics if you have to. But if you, for example, have rolls set up in your percussion map as tremolo, and you also have tremolo set up in an expression map, the two will conflict and you'll get unreliable results. It can be really disastrous and super, super frustrating. So I say just don't use an expression map on percussion. Use only a percussion map. You do not need to use both unless your circumstances are really unique. So let's take a look at this percussion map and see what's in it. So this table of data right here is exactly what I created in this spreadsheet over here. Now in my library, C2 triggers a left-hand sample. That's what I've noted up here. C2, these are just notes to myself. Whether or not you follow this exact workflow is up to you, but this is notes to myself. But the thing is that when I actually fire a C2 in Dorico, it's actually needs to be C3 in Dorico in order to trigger C2 in the sign player. And this is common this is often the case with different samplers and different pieces of software, where basically what middle C is may be defined as C3 or C4, or even in some cases C5. Whether it's one or the other is kind of up to the software developer, and we just have to know. So if you set everything up and you are not hearing any sound, then what I recommend you do is actually check out your player here, and you'll see like the wrong notes being triggered, like down here an octave too low, and you say to yourself, oh, that's my problem. So anyway, although this sample is in sign player, it says C2, I actually have to trigger C3. But anyway, these are, this was me getting my ducks in a row. This was me getting organized to produce this. Now the name, that is arbitrary. I could call that anything I want. I could call this, Jerry, and this Tom. I could go whatever I want. Instrument is crucial, because this is got to be an instrument in your score that you are referencing. Key switch here, this is very strange because key switch is actually a key, but in this case 24 is actually C0 because it's actually I believe C1, or one of the it goes one way or the other, as I was saying, by an octave when it gets to the sign player. But anyway, this key switch, I can't just put in C1 or C2. I actually have to put in the key number, which is weird and frustrating. I don't know why we have to do that, but that's what I have to do. So anyway, then I have playback techniques. So playback techniques, these are actually items from our playback techniques library, which is over here. If we were to be, I'll just click out of that. If we were in the Dorico menu and we went to the library menu to playback techniques, and you see all these things here, these, if it's not in one of these lists, like in ornaments here, I have flam and drag and that sort of thing. If it's not in there, you're never going to find it over here under playback techniques. So let's take an item here, And let's look at it. You can, once you selected it, you'll see that down here in the lower area, you can change that. And literally I could, you know, call this, you know, whatever I want, roll, yay. And I can save it. It's going to have absolutely no impact on the playback. This is just an arbitrary name. So I call it roll because I want to keep my head screwed on straight. But C4, this is the note name of the actual key that I'm going to strike on my keyboard to trigger the sample. This key switch over here is because my library Berlin series percussion puts single hits into a different collection from rolls and dynamics, and then you can actually use the key switch to choose between those dynamics. You'll see here, or collections rather. These are collections. I've got single hits with a snare off, rolls with a snare off, dynamics like diminuendo and crescendo, and then with the snare off. So I use key switches here to choose between single hits, rolls, and dynamics, and that is what this key switch here is for. A lot of libraries, you don't even need to worry about this because they aren't sorted into different collections. So that's really dependent on your library. But this note name over here, this is the key on the keyboard that is actually mapped. It's this key right here, you know, whatever this key is that's actually mapped to trigger a sample. You'll see that my rolls are set to a different range and the dynamics are set to yet another range. So I have to change not only the key switch here, but I also have to hit the appropriate key. And so thankfully Dorico gives me that flexibility here. Okay, so that should clarify how you set up the expression map. And then as long as it's assigned to your instrument, when you come back here and you play, you're going to get the sounds. Oops. All right. So that in a nutshell is how it all works. A couple of tips. Avoid using expression maps and percussion maps because there may be conflicts and they can be very confusing. Sketch out your percussion map beforehand. I suggest doing that. Also, go into your playback techniques and your playing techniques library and make sure that all the ones you need exist. For example, I needed to create a roll that ends with an accent because that's one of the options. There was not a flam, a drag. They were other things, so I created those playback techniques. But I would recommend, again, in order to get your ducks in a row before you start doing this, go through figure out what the list of playback techniques are that you need, and then go and look at the catalog and make sure they're already there, and if they're not, add them in, because it'll make your workflow a little smoother. When you're done with your percussion map, export it, right? So from the play menu or play mode in here, if we go in here, you can actually export down here and you can save it to a library file so you can use it later on. Now, if you want to use this in all your future projects, there's two options. One is you can import it each time. They don't seem to have a mechanism to just keep it as like there's that star feature a lot of times where you can say, I want to use this in all my future projects. Doesn't seem to work here, but it seems that if you save a project template that has that percussion map in it, then it will work in the future. You can also save it as part of your endpoint, so you can create an endpoint for your percussion instruments that uses the appropriate percussion map, and that will also be a way to kind of future-proof it. But definitely exporting a copy, you know, you're going to do a lot of work, may as well. Saving a project as a template, yeah, I mentioned that. And then as far as playing techniques or playback techniques, this is also good to know that when you come to playback techniques, sorry, I'm on the wrong menu here, like this little star down here, you want to make sure, like I went ahead and created flam, and then I hit star, and that means that this playback technique will be available in all future projects. It does not mean that it will be available in all past projects or any projects I open from now on. So just a quick tip, really has nothing to do with this. If you are in a situation where you're trying to get the you're trying to get playing techniques or playback techniques from another project into your existing project, the best thing to do is to maintain, this is what I do, I maintain a sort of master project that has all of my updated fonts and my playback techniques and everything in it. And anytime I need to make a change, I make a change to that and I save over my main template. And then if I need to get an old project to use all that stuff, a lot of times there's no way except start a new project, import a flow from an older project, and now it will have all those things. So it's definitely a bit of a headache, but that was actually an idea that Daniel had suggested on the forums. Just want to take a look at your comments here. So you change the playback in the bottom editor after inputting notes. In terms of workflow, if that's sort of the question, yes, basically, I would do that. So I'd come in here, and I'll take myself off the screen again. You know, I might start with this MIDI here, and then I'm just going to copy that down to this staff. And then because of my custom note heads, I now have all of these different options, and I can just drag them around. I could decide that, you know, instead of this roll, I wanted to see how it sounds if I use a roll accent, and that's using the shift option. Or Shift Alt if you're on Windows. You hold down Shift and Option or Shift and Alt, and you can use the up and down arrows to move around. So hopefully that answers your questions. And I will wrap it up there. If you have more questions, please leave them in the comments. Please like and subscribe if you're new to the channel and if you like the video. And I will be back on Wednesday at noon PST. I am going to be focusing on some drum related stuff for the next few lessons because I think that this is an area that definitely I want to learn more about, and I think is probably something a lot of people have questions about. So if you have questions about those things, about drums, let me know and I'll try and cover them this Wednesday and Friday. And so thank you very much for joining me again, and I will see you later. All right, bye for now.